From Jones starting a Twitter spat with Ngannou to the Predator feeling regret over their missed fight, Jon Jones has reacted to Francis Ngannou joining the PFL, and let's just say he's not fazed by the Cameroonian's big claims. After all, not only did Francis leave the UFC before he could prove himself against Jones, but he then went ahead and called himself the baddest motherfucker on the planet. I mean, how could you be that without facing the best? And yeah, that's exactly what Jon Bones Jones thinks as well. In fact, right after Francis said this on his YouTube channel, Jones took to Twitter and wrote, "Calling yourself the baddest man on the planet from across the street? Who does that?" Oh, and let's not forget that even though Francis was on a 6-fight winning streak before quitting the UFC, his MMA record is not even close to being as good as Bones. I mean, this dude's won 90% of his fights so far, with only a single disqualification that he got for beating his opponent too much. Like, it's understandable why he felt the need to go and remind the Predator who's the actual king here. That being said, Francis wasn't just going to let that slide either. So he clapped right back at Jon and said, "Then cross the street," asking him to come to the PFL if he was really that adamant about being the GOAT. Yeah, I'm pretty sure Jones is perfectly happy being the heavyweight champion in the UFC. Wait a sec though, if Francis's win streak really was that good, and if he was on the top of his game, then why did he leave the UFC in the first place? Well, that's been the big debate over the past year or so, because unlike some other athletes who like to go out while they're at the top, the Predator had entirely different reasoning. You see, the biggest issue the Cameroonian had with the UFC was the fact that they just didn't treat their fighters very well. Oh, and I'm not just talking about their pay, which, let's be fair, is also kind of horrendous for anyone who's not at the top. Ngannou argued that the fighters put their bodies through so much for the promotion, so it was only fair if they got some basic health benefits and things like that. He talked about how he wanted the UFC to value him as a person beyond just paying him a bunch and calling it a day. Now, it's worth noting that the former champ would have become the highest paid heavyweight in UFC history if he'd accepted Dana White's offer. But again, it was never about the money. And now, he's getting everything he asked for and more at PFL. The Professional Fighters League is, in many ways, the opposite of the UFC. It's got better pay, better benefits, and most importantly, it seems to actually care about the competitors. For the pay-per-view events, for example, 50% of the revenue will go to the fighters, which is unheard of in this sport. Oh, and yeah, it's very influencer-driven too, with people like Jake Paul and former women's lightweight champ Kayla Harrison. And Ngannou, of course, is the latest to join this ever-growing roster. Now, apparently, he won't be making his debut until mid-2024. Meaning he'll go without a single MMA fight for almost 2.5 years. But hey, he will be a part of PFL's Global Advisory Board, meaning he's got some power there. In fact, Francis will also be an equity owner and chairman of the upcoming PFL Africa. I mean, you don't turn that deal down, do you? Plus, the 36-year-old revealed that even his next opponent will make at least $2 million. Not to mention, the Cameroonian will have control over his own sponsorships and other deals, which, if you didn't know, he wasn't allowed to do in the UFC. He called it a fighter-first culture, and yeah, it shows. With that said, even though Ngannou's obviously happy about getting these perks, the fans are not, and honestly, I don't blame them. After all, if the Predator hadn't left the UFC, he was going to fight Jones next. I mean, that was the only obvious matchup for him after he managed to beat Ciryl Gane. But since he left, it came down to Gane and Jones fighting it out amongst themselves to determine the new heavyweight champion. And we all know how that went, right? The point is that Francis and Jon have been so far ahead of every other MMA fighter that any other opponent for them is just, well, boring. As a matter of fact, when the PFL announced that the Cameroonian was joining them on social media, their comments were flooded with fans expressing their anger. Some called him out for ducking Jones to go and fight amateurs, while others were disappointed that he went from one MMA organization to another rather than becoming a boxer. Oh, and then there were the skeptics who thought this was a temporary move, saying that Ngannou's going to abandon the PFL ship the second it starts sinking. One fan even pointed out how the fighter's gonna regret his move, because if he'd stayed for 2 or 3 more years, then he would have been the biggest combat sports athlete on the planet. I mean, they're not wrong, are they? Like, sure, Francis has got a ton of benefits, but there's no comparison between the popularity of the UFC and the PFL. Oh, and it's not just the fans who are mad about this move. Other pros think it's a mistake as well. Brendan Schaub, for instance, questioned whether throwing so much money at the fighters was even sustainable for the PFL. Of course, he congratulated Francis as well, but for him, this business model didn't make any sense, and he could see the league going down like many others have before it. Likewise, Conor McGregor was also happy for Ngannou, but talked about how there's literally no competition for someone like him. Oh, and he even mentioned that there's little to no buzz about this move, which should tell you everything about the popularity of the PFL. And, obviously, the UFC president, Dana White, was baffled by the deal as well, saying it made no sense to him. According to him, the fact that the PFL was going to pay Francis without getting any fights for a year was wild. Not to mention, there's no guarantee of the Cameroonian being consistent after his return either. After all, even before he joined the league, he'd had only 3 fights in 3 years. What's more, the UFC president also criticized Francis for ducking Jones, because for him, the 36-year-old didn't want to take any risks and wanted an easy way out. As a matter of fact, he went as far as to say that if Francis went up against Jones today, he'd suffer the same fate that Gane did. Having said that, even though everyone seems to think it's Ngannou's fault that this fight never happened, Ben Askren has a different opinion. Yep, he thinks that Jones is the one who's a hypocrite. After all, it's not like the Predator was never available for a fight, right? So Askren talked about how John chose to be inactive for 3 years, when he could have easily returned and taken the challenge to Francis. Not to mention, the Cameroonian was present in the UFC for pretty much the entirety of those 3 years, and it would have been very easy for Dana White to give the green light for that fight. That's why, according to Askren, Francis should be allowed to call himself the baddest man on the planet. Because even though Jones can argue all day long, he can't really stake his claim on that name. So with all that said and done, there's only one question on everyone's mind. Can we still get a bout between Jon Jones and Francis Ngannou? Well, if I'm being honest, crazy things have happened before. Like, sure, Dana White has ruled out the chance of Francis ever fighting in the UFC again. But if you go back and look at some of the other things he's said, you'd realize that he's not exactly a man of his word. Plus, this isn't the first time the 2 heavyweight fighters have had a back and forth on Twitter either. Like, when Jones won the title, Francis tweeted at him saying, "Good job, Johnny boy. Sincerely, the heavyweight king." So, the feud has been brewing for a while. What's more, even Jon Jones has said he'd be interested in a possible fight with the Predator if the opportunity ever presented itself. Now, he's obviously also said he could retire after fighting Miocic. However, he also said he'd reconsider a fight against Ngannou. Oh, and yeah, the Cameroonians expressed his desire to go against Jones as well, saying he did everything to have that fight when he was in the UFC. As a matter of fact, he went as far as to say that he'll always regret not fighting Jones. After all, he is the GOAT of the sport, and there's no one better you could test yourself against. So there you have it. From the Predator feeling regret over their missed fight, to Jones starting a Twitter spat with Francis. That was Jon Jones' reaction to Francis Ngannou joining the PFL.